The snow fell like broken promises across the Montana plains, each flake a whisper of winter's cruelty that had come too early and stayed too long. Marcus Blackwood guided his black stallion through the drifts with the patience of a man who had learned that rushing in this country meant dying, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air as he surveyed the vast emptiness of his ranch. 30,000 acres of prime cattle land stretched before him, worth more money than most men saw in 10 lifetimes. But wealth meant nothing when you rode alone through a world painted white with loneliness. The wind carried more than cold. That morning it carried the sound of crying, faint and desperate, like a wounded animal caught in a trap. Marcus pulled his horse to a stop, leather creaking in the silence, his grey eyes scanning the horizon until he spotted it. A small figure huddled against an old fence post, nearly invisible beneath a thin shawl that offered no protection against nature's assault. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching through snow that reached his knees, and approached with the careful movements of a man who understood that frightened creatures either ran or bit. She was young, maybe 19, with skin the color of burnished copper and long black hair that hung in frozen strands around her face. Her lips were blue with cold, her hands clutched protectively over a belly swollen with child, and her dark eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from walking too far with nowhere to go. When she saw him coming, she tried to stand but stumbled, one hand pressed against the fence post for support, the other never leaving her stomach. Marcus stopped 10 feet away, removed his hat in a gesture his mother had taught him 40 years ago, and spoke in a voice gentle as falling snow. "Miss," he said, "you look like you could use some help." She stared at him with suspicion, born of too many broken promises, her breath coming in short puffs that hung in the air between them like punctuation marks in a conversation neither knew how to start. "My name's Marcus Blackwood. This is my land. And that storm coming over the ridge is going to kill anyone caught in it." He gestured toward the darkening clouds that rolled across the sky like an army of shadows. "I've got a warm house, hot food, and no intention of causing you harm." She shook her head, backing away despite having nowhere to go, her feet sliding in the snow. "No," she whispered, her voice carrying an accent that spoke of reservation schools and broken treaties. "I keep walking. I find my way." Marcus studied her face, seeing the fear there, but also something deeper, a determination that reminded him of his prize horses, the ones that would rather die than surrender their spirit. "Where you walking to in this storm, miss?" he asked, settling back on his heels to make himself less threatening. "Next town's 40 miles through country that'll freeze you solid before you make it halfway." The wind gusted harder, driving snow like needles against their faces, and the girl's knees buckled slightly. Marcus saw her jaw clench, saw her fighting to stay upright when her body wanted to collapse. "I have to," she said, one hand moving to her belly as if protecting something more precious than her own life. "They find me, they take my baby, say I'm not fit. Say I got no husband, no family, no right." Her voice broke on the last word, and Marcus felt something old and angry stir in his chest, memories of his own sister's tears when the world had judged her harshly for loving the wrong man. Marcus stood slowly, putting his hat back on and extending one gloved hand toward her. "Miss, I don't know who they are, but I can tell you this: nobody's taking anybody's baby on my land, not while I'm breathing." She looked at his hand like it might be a trap, her whole body trembling now from cold and exhaustion. "I'm not asking you to trust me forever, just long enough to get out of this storm." The girl's legs gave out then, and she sank into the snow with a small cry of defeat. Marcus was beside her in 3 strides, his arms steady as he helped her to her feet, careful not to touch more than necessary, but firm enough to keep her from falling. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way her lips had gone past blue to purple, the desperate exhaustion that had driven her past the point where pride mattered more than survival. "What's your name?" he asked, as he guided her toward his horse. one arm supporting her weight while she leaned against him like a bird with a broken wing. "Sarah," she whispered, and something in the way she said it told him it wasn't the name she was born with, but the one she'd chosen for reasons he didn't need to understand. "Sarah's a good name," he said, lifting her gently onto the saddle and swinging up behind her. "Known a few good women named Sarah in my time." The ride to the house passed in silence, broken only by the horse's steady breathing and the soft sound of snow falling on snow. Sarah sat stiff in the saddle at first, every muscle tense with the expectation of betrayal. But as the minutes passed and Marcus's arms remained respectfully positioned on either side of her without pulling her close, she began to relax slightly. The warmth from his body seeped through her thin shawl, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she might live to see her child born. The Blackwood ranch house rose from the snow like something from a dream. 3 stories of warm stone and timber with windows that glowed yellow against the gathering storm. Marcus had built it after his cattle operation made him rich, designing every room with the family he'd planned to fill it with. But that family had never come. Now it stood as monument to wealth without purpose, comfort without companionship, until today, when it finally had someone who truly needed shelter. Marcus carried Sarah inside despite her weak protests, settling her on the leather sofa nearest the massive stone fireplace, where logs crackled and threw dancing shadows on the walls. The warmth hit her like a physical force, and she gasped as feeling began to return to her frozen fingers and toes. He disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a steaming mug of coffee and a plate of thick bread spread with butter and honey. "Eat slow," he advised, settling into the chair across from her with his own cup. "Your stomach's probably forgotten what food feels like." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her bones before taking a careful sip. The coffee was strong and black, nothing like the weak chicory she'd grown used to, and it made her feel more human than she had in weeks. "Why you helping me?" she asked, when she'd managed half the bread and could speak without her voice shaking. "You don't know me, don't know what trouble I might bring." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the firelight. She was beautiful, he realized, beneath the exhaustion and fear, beautiful in the way wild things were beautiful, untamed and genuine. "My sister was about your age when she got in trouble," he said quietly. "Different kind of trouble, but trouble all the same. Fell in love with a gambler, got herself pregnant, and our father threw her out into a winter not much different from this one." He paused, staring into the fire as memories 20 years old played across his face. "I was 17, stupid, and too scared of the old man to follow her. Found her body come spring, her and the baby both, froze solid under a bridge in Denver." Sarah set down her cup, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Marcus shrugged, but she could see the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched slightly when he spoke of finding his sister. "Been carrying that regret for 23 years, he said. "Figure maybe helping you might balance the scales a little." He looked at her directly then, his grey eyes serious but kind. "You don't have to tell me your story, Sarah. But you should know that whatever trouble you're running from, you're safe here as long as you need to be." The storm raged for 3 days, turning the world outside into a white wilderness that erased all boundaries between earth and sky. Sarah slept in the guest room on the 2nd floor, in a bed soft as clouds beneath quilts that smelled of lavender and safety. Marcus moved through the house like a ghost, appearing with meals and clean clothes and disappearing again, giving her space to heal while making sure she wanted for nothing. On the 2nd day, he found her standing at the kitchen window, one hand pressed against the glass as she watched snow fall in the courtyard. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling a fresh cup of coffee beside her elbow. She glanced at him, then back at the snow, her reflection ghost-like in the window. "Where I come from, we say snow is the earth sleeping," she said quietly. "Time for rest, for dreams, for things to grow in secret. Her hand moved to her belly, and Marcus understood she wasn't talking about the weather anymore. My grandmother, she said babies born in snow time are blessed. They know how to survive anything, how to find warmth in cold places. Sounds like a wise woman, Marcus said, leaning against the counter beside her. She's still with you? Sarah shook her head, pain flickering across her features like shadow from a passing cloud. Died last winter. Cancer. After that, everything changed. She turned away from the window, facing him fully for the first time since he'd brought her home. Her house was on reservation land, but when she died, they said I had no claim, no husband, no tribal enrollment, no rights. They gave me 2 weeks to leave. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard stories, knew how the system worked to break people who had no voice, no power, no advocates willing to fight for them. What about the baby's father? He asked carefully, not wanting to intrude, but needing to understand. Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. He was married, white man from town who liked to visit the reservation when he needed something different. When I told him about the baby, he said I was lying, said even if it was true, nobody would believe a squaw over him. The ugly word hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt something hot and dangerous kindle in his chest. That's not a word I allow in my house, he said quietly, but there was steel beneath the softness. And any man who'd abandon a woman carrying his child isn't worth the air he breathes. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of pity or false comfort, but found only honest anger on her behalf. Most people would say he was right, she said, testing him. Say a girl like me got no business expecting anything from a man like him. Oh, Marcus pushed away from the counter, standing to his full height. And for a moment she could see the power he carried, not just wealth, but the kind of quiet authority that came from being a man who kept his word. Most people are fools, he said simply, and I've never been much for listening to fools. He moved to the stove, checking the soup that had been simmering all morning. You hungry? This storm's got me cooking for an army out of habit. They ate together at the kitchen table, talking about small things, the ranch, the horses, the books that lined the shelves in the library. Sarah discovered that Marcus was educated, well-read, and possessed of a dry humor that made her laugh despite everything she'd been through. He learned that she was intelligent, observant, and stronger than anyone who'd tried to break her had expected. On the third day, the storm finally broke, leaving the world crystalline and impossibly white under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Marcus found Sarah on the front porch, wrapped in one of his coats, staring across the snow-covered range with an expression he couldn't read. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, settling beside her on the porch swing he'd built but rarely used. Dangerous as hell, but beautiful. Sarah nodded, pulling the coat tighter around herself. It smelled like him leather and coffee, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safer than she had any right to feel. I should go, she said, without conviction. Roads will be cleared soon. Don't want to impose any more? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching his breath form clouds in the cold air. Where are you planning to go? He asked finally. Still heading for that town 40 miles away? Sarah's silence was answer enough. She had no plan, no destination, no future beyond keeping her baby safe and herself alive. Sarah, he said, his voice careful as a man walking on thin ice, I've got a proposition for you. Might sound crazy, but hear me out. She turned to look at him, dark eyes wary but curious. This house has more rooms than one man could use in a lifetime. Ranch needs someone to help with the books, the correspondence, the 1,000 little things that keep slipping through the cracks. It's honest work, fair pay, and nobody needs to know anything about your situation they don't need to know. Sarah stared at him, searching his face for the catch, the expectation, the price that always came with offers too good to be true. Why? She asked. Why would you do that for a stranger? Marcus removed his hat, running his fingers through hair that had started going grey at the temples. Because I'm tired of rattling around this place like a ghost, he said honestly, because you need help and I need purpose, and maybe we can be useful to each other. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And because I believe in second chances, even when I haven't always given them to myself. The baby chose that moment to kick, a flutter of movement that made Sarah gasp and press her hand to her belly. Marcus saw the wonder that crossed her face, the way her whole expression softened as she felt her child move, and something in his chest cracked open like ice in spring. "Do you believe in miracles, Sarah?" he asked quietly, and she looked at him with eyes that held tears she wouldn't let fall. "I'm starting to," she whispered, and in that moment something began that neither of them had expected when he'd found her freezing in the snow hope. Fragile and precious as a newborn thing, but real as the ground beneath their feet. The weeks that followed passed with the slow rhythm of winter days and the growing comfort of shared routines. Sarah proved herself invaluable, her quick mind and careful attention transforming the chaos of Marcus's business records into organized efficiency. She worked from the library most days, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, her presence bringing life to rooms that had stood empty too long. Marcus watched her bloom like a flower finding sunlight, her natural warmth emerging as she grew to trust that this safety was real. She laughed more easily now, sang quietly while she worked, and the haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by something softer, more hopeful. Her belly grew rounder with each passing week, and Marcus found himself watching for signs that the baby was healthy, that Sarah was strong enough for what lay ahead. They were careful around each other, maintaining the respectful distance of employer and employee, but the barriers between them grew thinner with each shared meal, each evening spent by the fire reading or talking about everything and nothing. Marcus had never known comfort like this, the simple pleasure of coming home to find someone there, of sharing the small details of his day with someone who listened like it mattered. It was Sarah who noticed the riders first, 3 men in dark coats picking their way through the snow toward the house on a grey February morning. She watched them from the library window, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as old fears rose in her throat like bile. "Marcus," she called, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. He appeared in the doorway, took one look at her face, and moved to the window. The men were still a quarter-mile away, but Marcus recognized the rigid posture of officialdom, the grim purpose that drove men through snow and cold on missions they considered righteous. "You know who they are?" he asked, though her expression had already told him the answer. Sarah nodded, sinking into the chair behind the desk, as if her legs could no longer support her. "Child welfare," she whispered. "Someone must have told them where I am." Her hands shook as she pressed them against her belly, protective and desperate. "They said they'd find me, said they wouldn't let me keep my baby." Marcus felt the old rage rising in him, the same fury that had driven him to build an empire from nothing after the world had taught him that only money and power could protect the things you loved. "How long until your due date?" he asked, his voice calm despite the storm building in his chest. 6 weeks, Sarah said, tears starting to fall, despite her efforts to stay strong. "Maybe less." "Oh God, Marcus, what if they take her? What if they say I'm unfit before she's even born?" Marcus moved to the desk, placing his hands flat on the surface as he leaned toward her, his grey eyes fierce with determination. "Listen to me, Sarah. Nobody is taking your baby. Nobody is deciding what's best for you except you." He straightened, already forming a plan that would have shocked his younger self with its audacity. "But we need to make some changes, and we need to make them fast." The knock came at the front door like judgment itself, heavy, official, impatient. Marcus answered it with the easy confidence of a man who owned everything he could see, and most of what he couldn't, his expensive clothes and obvious wealth, sending an immediate message about who held power in this conversation. "Gentlemen," he said pleasantly, not inviting them in, "what brings you out on such a cold day?" The lead man, thin and sharp-faced with the pinched expression of someone who found joy in other people's misery, consulted a paper in his gloved hands. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Agent Patterson from the Department of Child Welfare. We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive, a pregnant Indian woman named Sarah Crow Feather, who's evaded our custody for several months. Marcus's expression never changed, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name, he said mildly, though I'd be curious to know what crime this woman is supposed to have committed that makes her a fugitive. Patterson's face flushed slightly, recognizing the trap in the question. She's not charged with a crime, he admitted. But she's demonstrated herself unfit for motherhood. No husband, no stable home, no means of support. The child will be better served in a proper Christian household. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this reasoning. I see. And you have legal authority to remove children from unmarried mothers? He asked. Because I'd hate to think officials were overstepping their bounds on my property. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who owned judges and politicians the way other men owned cattle. Before Patterson could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway behind Marcus, and the agent's eyes lit with triumph. But something was different about her now. She stood straighter, her chin raised with quiet dignity, and on her left hand glinted a simple gold band that caught the light like a promise. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his arm moving protectively around Sarah's shoulders, "I'd like you to meet my wife." The word landed like thunder in the sudden silence, and Sarah leaned into his strength, playing her part in their desperate gamble with the skill of someone who understood that sometimes survival required perfect acting. Patterson sputtered, his certainty cracking like ice in spring thaw. "Your wife? This is the first anyone's heard of Marcus Blackwood being married." Marcus smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut glass. "I've never been one to share my personal business with strangers," he said. "Sarah and I were married quietly 3 months ago, and we're expecting our first child in the spring." He pulled her closer, and she melted against him with such natural grace that even she almost believed the story they were telling. "You have proof of this marriage?" Patterson demanded, grasping for authority that was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Marcus reached into his coat and produced a document that looked official enough to satisfy even careful scrutiny. "Filed with the county clerk last week," he said, handing over the marriage certificate he'd had drawn up that morning by a lawyer who asked no questions when Marcus Blackwood needed favors. "Everything legal and proper, as befits a woman of Sarah's quality." Patterson examined the document with the desperate intensity of a man watching his righteous mission crumble into meaningless bureaucracy. The certificate was perfect, complete with official seals and signatures that would pass any reasonable inspection. More importantly, Sarah Blackwood was not the same person as Sarah Crowfeather, at least not in any legal sense that mattered. "This doesn't change the fact that she's Indian," one of the other men said, the ugly word dripping with contempt. Marcus's smile vanished, replaced by an expression that made grown men take involuntary steps backward. "That would be my wife you're speaking about," he said, his voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "And I'd suggest you remember where you are and who you're talking to before you say another word." The man paled, suddenly remembering that Marcus Blackwood was not just wealthy but connected, the kind of man who could end careers with a single phone call to the right people. Patterson handed back the marriage certificate with obvious reluctance. "We'll be verifying this," he warned, but the fight had gone out of him. A married woman with a wealthy husband was not the easy target he'd expected to find. "You do that," Marcus said pleasantly, "and while you're at it, you might want to check with the county attorney about the penalties for harassment of private citizens on their own property." He let that sink in for a moment. "I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear about government agents threatening pregnant women." The men left without another word, their horses disappearing into the distance like shadows fleeing daylight. Marcus and Sarah stood in the doorway until they were gone, neither moving nor speaking, both afraid that words might break the spell that had just saved them. "Is it real?" Sarah asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The certificate, I mean. Marcus nodded, still watching the empty horizon where the riders had vanished. Real as anything else in this world, he said. Bought and paid for, witnessed and filed. In the eyes of the law, we're married. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. Question is, what do we do about it? Sarah studied his face, seeing the kindness there, the strength, the careful distance he maintained even now when they'd just pledged their lives to each other in front of God and the government. Do you regret it? She asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. I've regretted a lot of things in my life, Sarah. Not helping my sister, not standing up to my father, not having the courage to live the way I wanted instead of the way I was expected to. He reached for her hand, his fingers gentle around hers. But marrying you isn't going to be one of them. Day, the baby came on a night when spring was just beginning to green the edges of winter, born into a world made soft by rain and new grass. Sarah labored through the long hours with Marcus beside her, his hand steady in hers as she fought to bring their child into the world. When the baby finally arrived with a cry that echoed through the ranch house like a declaration of war against every force that had tried to prevent her existence, Sarah wept with joy and exhaustion, and the fierce protective love that made everything else seem small and distant. She's perfect, Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at the tiny girl in Sarah's arms. The baby had her mother's dark eyes and hair, but something in the shape of her face spoke of the man who'd claimed her as his own before she was even born. Maria, Sarah said softly, the name they'd chosen together during the long winter evenings when they'd planned for this moment. Maria Blackwood. The baby turned toward the sound of her mother's voice, tiny fingers curling around Sarah's thumb with a grip that seemed to hold all the promise of the future they were building together. Marcus leaned down to kiss Sarah's forehead, then gently touched one finger to his daughter's cheek. "Welcome home, little one," he murmured, and in those words was everything he'd never been able to say about love and family and the miracles that could grow from the simplest acts of human kindness. Years passed like pages in a book written by contentment itself. The ranch prospered under their joint care, Sarah's intelligence and warmth complementing Marcus's business acumen and determination. Maria grew like a wildflower in good soil, surrounded by love and security, her laughter echoing through rooms that had waited too long to hear the sound of a child's joy. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch swing Marcus had built for courting a wife he'd never thought he'd find, watching Maria chase fireflies across the meadow while the sun painted the mountains purple and gold. Sarah would lean against her husband's shoulder, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly where their second child grew, and marvel at the strange paths that had led them to this perfect, ordinary happiness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" she asked one evening, her voice dreamy with contentment. Marcus considered the question, his arm tightening around her as Maria's laughter drifted across the cooling air. "I try not to think about it," he said honestly. "Some things are too terrible to imagine." He pressed his lips to her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of wildflowers and home. "I prefer to think about what we're going to do with all the time we have left." Sarah smiled, watching their daughter discover the magic of a world where she was loved and wanted and safe. "I love you, Marcus Blackwood," she said, the words as natural as breathing now, though they'd taken months to find their way to her lips. "I love you too, Sarah Blackwood," he replied, and in the gathering dusk of their shared life, surrounded by the evidence of their impossible happiness, they knew that sometimes miracles were as simple as one person choosing to see another's worth and act on it, no matter what the world might say about the wisdom of such choices. The ranch stretched before them like a promise kept, fertile and green, and full of the kind of peace that could only be built by two people who'd found each other when they needed saving most. And in the distance, Maria's laughter rang out like a bell, announcing that love, in the end, was always stronger than the forces that tried to deny it.